The amber glow of the faculty lounge cast long shadows across weathered leather chairs as two of history's most influential philosophers found themselves face to face on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. The question hanging between them had torn apart courtrooms, toppled governments, and haunted the conscience of humanity for centuries. Should justice be grounded in the cold certainty of reason or the warm embrace of human compassion? Immanuel Kant, the methodical German philosopher whose rigid schedule once allowed townspeople to set their clocks by his daily walks, sat with characteristic precision. His fingers drummed a measured rhythm against his coffee cup, each tap calculated like the moral laws he spent his life constructing. Across from him, Hannah Arendt leaned forward with an intensity that seemed to absorb the room's light, her eyes reflecting the weight of witnessing humanity's darkest chapters. "You know, Immanuel," Arendt began, her voice carrying traces of her German accent softened by years of American exile, "I've spent decades thinking about what went wrong in Germany, how ordinary people became complicit in unthinkable evil, and I keep coming back to the same troubling conclusion." Kant raised an eyebrow, his posture remaining perfectly erect, which is that your beautiful rational system of ethics, this categorical imperative you're so fond of, it failed when we needed it most. People followed orders, followed rules, followed what they believed were universal moral laws, and 6 million Jews died. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Kant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Hannah, with all due respect, you're conflating obedience to authority with adherence to moral law. The categorical imperative demands we act only according to principles we could will to be universal laws. No rational person could will genocide to be a universal law." "But that's exactly my point," Arendt shot back, setting down her tea with enough force to create ripples. "You assume people are rational actors making careful moral calculations, but they're not. They're human beings living in specific contexts, facing particular pressures, making split-second decisions based on incomplete information and competing loyalties. The debate that was about to unfold would challenge everything both thinkers held sacred about the nature of justice, morality, and human responsibility. For Kant, justice was a mathematical equation: apply reason, follow duty, achieve moral certainty. For Arendt, justice was an art form requiring judgment, empathy, and the courage to act in an uncertain world. "Let me ask you something, Hannah," Kant said, leaning forward slightly. "If justice isn't based on universal principles that apply equally to all people in all situations, then what prevents it from becoming mere opinion? What stops justice from meaning whatever those in power want it to mean?" Arendt smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sadness. "You're asking the wrong question, my friend. The question isn't how to make justice universal and certain. The question is how to make it human and responsive to the actual conditions in which people live, suffer, and hope." Outside, thunder rolled across the campus, as if the heavens themselves were weighing in on this ancient debate. The rain intensified, drumming against windows like fingers impatiently tapping, waiting for resolution to a question that had no easy answers. Kant straightened his already perfect posture. "Then let me make my case. Justice based on reason isn't cold or mechanical. It's liberating. When we ground justice in universal principles derived through rational thought, we free it from the arbitrary whims of emotion, prejudice, and self-interest. We create a system where every person, regardless of their background or circumstances, is treated according to the same moral standards. And I'll argue," Arendt countered, "that such a system, however well-intentioned, inevitably becomes a tyranny of abstraction. It treats human beings as interchangeable units in a moral equation rather than unique individuals embedded in webs of relationship and meaning. Real justice requires judgment, not just rule-following. It requires the ability to see each situation in its full complexity and respond with wisdom rather than formula." The stage was set for a confrontation that would probe the deepest foundations of moral philosophy. On one side stood the architect of duty-based ethics, the man who insisted that goodwill guided by reason was the only unconditional good in the universe. On the other sat the political theorist who had witnessed the collapse of civilization and emerged convinced that human plurality and the capacity for fresh beginnings were the only antidotes to moral catastrophe. As the evening deepened and the storm outside intensified, both philosophers knew they were grappling with more than abstract principles. They were wrestling with the question of how human beings could live together justly in a world marked by uncertainty, diversity, and the ever-present possibility of both tremendous good and unspeakable evil. The debate was about to begin in earnest, and neither thinker was prepared to yield ground easily. Kant clasped his hands together with the deliberate precision of a clockmaker, assembling the most delicate mechanism. The gesture was familiar to anyone who had attended his lectures, a signal that he was about to construct an argument with architectural certainty. Hannah, before we can discuss what justice should look like in practice, we must establish what makes any moral judgment valid in the first place. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to building philosophical systems from the ground up. The problem with basing justice on compassion or feeling is that emotions are notoriously unreliable guides to moral truth. Arendt stirred her tea thoughtfully, watching the small whirlpool she created. "I'm listening. Consider this," Kant continued, warming to his theme. "A judge feels enormous sympathy for a defendant who reminds him of his own son. Another judge feels disgust toward a defendant whose crime triggers painful memories. If we base justice on these emotional responses, we get different verdicts for identical crimes. Is that justice? That's assuming emotions are just random impulses rather than responses to genuine moral features of situations," Arendt interjected. "But continue." Kant nodded acknowledgement but pressed forward. "The categorical imperative solves this problem by providing a test that any rational person can apply consistently. When considering an action, ask yourself, could I will this to be a universal law? Could I want everyone in similar circumstances to act this way?" He stood and began pacing, his movement as measured as his speech. "Take the simple case of promise-keeping. If I make a promise with no intention of keeping it, I'm treating the other person merely as a means to my own ends. More importantly, if everyone acted this way, the very institution of promising would collapse. No one would believe promises, making them meaningless." The fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize Kant's gestures as he continued building his case. "This isn't abstract philosophy, Hannah. This is the foundation of any just society. When we ground justice in reason rather than emotion, we create equal treatment under law. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all are subject to the same moral standards." Arendt had been listening with the kind of intense attention she once brought to courtroom proceedings. "It's beautiful, Emmanuel. Truly, the elegance of your system is undeniable, but you're describing justice as if it operates in a laboratory, isolated from the messy realities of human existence." "Not isolated," Kant corrected, "elevated above partiality and prejudice. But here's what troubles me," Arendt said, setting down her cup and leaning forward. "Your categorical imperative assumes that moral situations come pre-packaged, with clear categories. Promise-keeping, truth-telling, respect for persons. These seem obvious. But what about the situations where moral principles conflict? What about cases where the application of universal rules leads to outcomes that violate our deepest sense of justice?" Kant paused in his pacing. "Give me an example." "The French resistance during World War II," Arendt replied without hesitation. "According to your ethical system, lying is categorically wrong. You've argued that we should tell the truth even to murderers asking for the location of their intended victims. But when Gestapo officers asked French citizens about hidden Jewish children, was the moral response really to tell the truth?" The question hit like a physical blow. Kant's composure wavered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "The moral law doesn't guarantee pleasant outcomes, Hannah. It guarantees moral purity of action. We cannot control consequences, but we can control our intentions and our adherence to duty." "Moral purity," Arendt repeated slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "Do you hear how that sounds? While children were being loaded onto cattle cars, you're talking about keeping your philosophical hands clean. That's not morality, Emmanuel. That's moral cowardice dressed up in fancy language." The accusation hung between them like a sword. Rain continued to assault the windows, each drop like a small judgment falling from the darkened sky. Kant's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a tremor of controlled anger. "You mistake clarity for coldness, principle for callousness. The categorical imperative doesn't ignore human suffering. It provides the only reliable foundation for preventing it. When we abandon universal moral principles for situational judgments, we open the door to every form of relativism and abuse. And when we cling to universal principles regardless of context," Arendt countered, "we risk becoming what I call thoughtless, people who follow rules without engaging in the hard work of moral judgment. Some of the worst crimes in history have been committed by people who believed they were following higher moral laws. Kant stopped pacing and fixed her with a steady gaze. Are you suggesting that reason itself is dangerous? I'm suggesting that reason divorced from judgment, from attention to particularity, from genuine engagement with other human beings in their concrete circumstances, yes, that kind of reason is extraordinarily dangerous. It's the reason of bureaucrats filing reports on the efficiency of death camps. The comparison stung, and both philosophers fell silent for a moment. Outside, the storm seemed to be reaching its peak, wind howling around the building like voices demanding to be heard. Finally, Kant spoke, his voice quieter, but no less determined. Hannah, I understand your concerns, I truly do, but consider the alternative you're proposing. If justice is based on compassion and particular judgments rather than universal principles, who decides which particular judgments are valid? Who determines when compassion should override established law? You're not describing a system of justice, you're describing enlightened despotism. Arendt smiled grimly. Or I'm describing what Hannah Arendt calls judgment, the human capacity to think without banisters, to respond to new situations without predetermined rules, to act in the spaces between past and future where real political and moral life happens. The philosophical battle lines were now clearly drawn, and neither combatant showed any sign of retreat. Arendt rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to the tall windows where rain continued its relentless percussion against the glass. She pressed her palm against the cool surface, watching water trails create temporary maps across the pane. Let me tell you about Adolf Eichmann, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had stared evil in the face and found it disturbingly ordinary. I sat through his entire trial in Jerusalem, watching this small, balding bureaucrat who helped orchestrate the murder of millions. Do you know what struck me most? Kant remained seated, but his attention was absolute. What? He wasn't a monster. He wasn't even particularly anti-Semitic. He was a thoughtless man who followed orders, who took pride in doing his duty efficiently. He genuinely believed he was being moral by faithfully executing the commands of his superiors. He had rules, Emmanuel. He had principles. He followed them with exactly the kind of rational consistency you admire. She turned from the window, her eyes blazing with conviction. This is what your categorical imperative produces when applied without judgment, without attention to the human reality of what those universal principles actually mean in concrete situations. Kant's face had grown pale, but his voice remained steady. Eichmann wasn't following the categorical imperative, Hannah. He was following authority. The categorical imperative demands autonomous moral reasoning, not blind obedience. But that's exactly my point, Arendt said, moving closer. Eichmann thought he was being autonomous. He had internalized what he believed were universal moral principles: duty to the state, loyalty to authority, efficiency in execution of responsibilities. Your system provided no resources for questioning those principles once they were accepted as universal laws. She settled into the chair across from him, her movements sharp with intellectual energy. Real justice requires something your philosophy cannot provide: the capacity for fresh judgment in unprecedented situations. When the Nazis created an entirely new form of evil, something the world had never seen before, existing moral rules were inadequate. People needed to think and judge anew. Kant shifted uncomfortably. But without universal principles as guides, how do we distinguish good judgment from bad judgment? How do we prevent justice from becoming arbitrary? Through plurality, Arendt responded immediately. Through the presence of others who can challenge our perspectives, force us to see situations from multiple angles, prevent us from retreating into the solitude of private moral calculation. Justice isn't something we figure out alone in our studies, Emmanuel. It emerges from genuine engagement with other people in the shared world we inhabit together. She paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. You talk about treating people as ends in themselves rather than mere means. I appreciate that. But your ethical system still treats moral decision-making as an essentially private activity. You go into your rational deliberation, apply your categorical imperative, and emerge with the correct answer. Where's the space for others to contribute their perspectives? Where's the recognition that different people might legitimately see the same situation differently? The fire popped suddenly, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars seeking escape. Kant watched them disappear before responding. Hannah, you're describing something that sounds more like politics than justice. Justice requires impartiality, consistency, principles that transcend particular perspectives and interests. If every person's viewpoint is equally valid, then we have no basis for saying that any particular judgment is wrong. No, Arendt said firmly. I'm not arguing for relativism. I'm arguing for judgment. There's a crucial difference between saying anything goes and saying we must think carefully about each situation in its full complexity before deciding how to act. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the space between them. Let me give you a different example. During the civil rights movement, protesters violated laws they considered unjust. According to your categorical imperative, law-breaking cannot be universalized. If everyone broke laws they disagreed with, legal systems would collapse. So the protesters were acting immorally. Not necessarily, Kant began, but Arendt cut him off. But here's the thing. Those protesters weren't trying to universalize law-breaking. They were making particular judgments about particular laws in particular circumstances. They were willing to face the consequences of their actions precisely because they understood the gravity of civil disobedience. They were exercising judgment, not following rules. She stood again, beginning to pace in counterpoint to Kant's earlier movement. This is what I mean by justice, requiring compassion rather than just reason. Not sentimental feeling, but the kind of compassion that comes from genuine attention to other people's experiences, genuine engagement with the concrete realities of how power operates, how suffering is distributed, how hope survives in impossible circumstances. And yet, Kant said quietly, without universal principles, how do we critique injustice? How do we say that slavery is wrong, that genocide is evil, that some forms of treatment are absolutely unacceptable regardless of cultural context or majority opinion? Arendt stopped pacing, struck by the question. We say it through judgment, informed by our capacity to imagine ourselves in others' situations, our ability to think representatively, our commitment to preserving the space where human beings can appear before one another as unique individuals. We don't need universal principles carved in stone, Emmanuel. We need the ongoing practice of thinking and judging together. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the philosophical tension in the room. Both thinkers could feel they were approaching the heart of their disagreement, a fundamental divide about the nature of moral thinking itself. But Hannah, Kant said slowly, what you're describing sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice, doesn't it just privilege those who are better educated, more articulate, more skilled at the kind of sophisticated judgment you're advocating? Doesn't it create a system where justice depends on having the right kind of cultural capital? Arendt paused, caught off guard by the objection. For the first time in their conversation, she seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither philosopher was quite ready to cross. Arendt moved back to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the storm-darkened glass. When she finally spoke, her voice carried new weight. You've hit on something important, Emmanuel. The danger of judgment becoming elitist, accessible only to those with education and leisure time for sophisticated moral reflection. It's a real concern. She turned to face him. But let me ask you something in return. When you develop your universal moral principles through pure practical reason, who exactly is doing that reasoning? Kant's brow furrowed. Any rational being capable of moral thought. Any rational being, Arendt repeated slowly. But in practice, hasn't moral philosophy been dominated by educated European men with enough economic security to spend their time thinking about abstract principles? When you speak of universal reason, aren't you actually universalizing a very particular cultural perspective? The question struck home. Kant's systematic philosophy, for all its claims to universality, had emerged from a specific historical and cultural context. That's an unfair characterization, Hannah. The principles I derive may have cultural origins, but their validity depends on their rational structure, not their historical development. Is it unfair? Arendt pressed. Let me tell you about someone I met during my years of statelessness after fleeing Germany. A woman named Rosa, a Roma who had lost her entire family in the camps. Rosa couldn't read or write, had never heard of Immanuel Kant or categorical imperatives, but when she found a Jewish child hiding in the woods and chose to risk her life protecting him, was she acting immorally because she couldn't articulate universal principles? Kant opened his mouth to respond, but Arendt continued. Rosa's decision wasn't based on philosophical calculation. It was based on recognition, seeing another human being in desperate need and responding from her capacity for solidarity. She understood something your rational system misses, That morality isn't primarily about following rules, but about taking responsibility for the world we share with others. The fire had burned lower, casting longer shadows that seemed to make the room feel smaller, more intimate. Kant rubbed his temples, a gesture that betrayed the intellectual pressure he was feeling. Hannah, I don't deny that people can act morally without understanding moral philosophy. My point is that moral philosophy helps us understand why certain actions are right or wrong, provides criteria for evaluating moral claims, prevents us from simply following our immediate impulses or cultural prejudices. But that's exactly what I'm questioning, Arendt replied, returning to her chair. The assumption that we need criteria external to our human capacity for judgment and response, the assumption that morality is primarily a matter of getting the right answer, rather than taking responsibility for our actions and their consequences. She leaned forward, her voice growing more urgent. During the Nuremberg trials, do you know what the most chilling testimony was? Not the sadistic guards or the fanatical true believers. It was the ordinary functionaries who insisted they had done nothing wrong because they had followed orders, followed procedures, followed what they understood to be universal principles of duty and obedience. Those weren't moral principles, Kant protested. They were administrative directives. But how do we tell the difference? Arendt shot back. That's my point. These people genuinely believed they were being moral. They had what they took to be universal principles: loyalty, duty, efficiency, order. They applied these principles consistently. They felt good about their moral purity. Your categorical imperative provided no resources for questioning the content of those principles once they were accepted as universal. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Outside, lightning illuminated the campus in stark, momentary clarity before plunging it back into darkness. Kant was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming that same measured rhythm against his knee. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than before. Hannah, I hear what you're saying, and I won't pretend the historical record doesn't raise difficult questions for any moral philosophy. But consider this: if we abandon the search for universal principles, if we make justice entirely dependent on particular judgments in particular situations, don't we lose any grounds for criticizing injustice? He stood and moved to the fireplace, staring into the dying flames. When American colonists claimed that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, they were making a universal claim that transcended their particular cultural context. When abolitionists argued against slavery, when suffragettes demanded voting rights, when civil rights leaders challenged segregation, they appealed to universal principles of human dignity and equality. Yes, Arendt said quietly, but notice how those universal principles meant different things to different people in different contexts. The founders who proclaimed that all men are created equal still held slaves. Universal principles don't interpret themselves, Emmanuel. They require judgment about what they mean in concrete situations. Which brings us back to the same problem, Kant said, turning to face her. Who exercises that judgment? Based on what criteria? You keep talking about judgment as if it's self-evidently good, but history is full of terrible judgments made by people who were completely sincere. Arendt nodded slowly. You're right. Judgment can be wrong, can be corrupted by prejudice or self-interest or simple lack of imagination, but that's why it can't be a solitary activity. That's why it requires plurality, requires the presence of others who can challenge our perspectives and force us to see situations from angles we might miss on our own. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. The difference between us, I think, is that you want moral certainty while I want moral responsibility. You want principles that guarantee the right answer, while I want practices that keep us open to questioning our answers. And the difference, Kant replied, is that I want justice that doesn't depend on who happens to be in the room making decisions. I want principles that protect the vulnerable even when, especially when, the powerful find it inconvenient. The philosophical chasm between them had never seemed wider, yet both could sense they were approaching something crucial. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the intellectual tempest in the room was far from over. As the storm's fury began to wane, a new tension filled the room, the kind that comes when long-held beliefs face their most serious challenges. Arendt poured herself fresh tea, the simple domestic gesture a stark contrast to the philosophical battle raging between them. Let me try a different approach, Emmanuel, she said, settling back in her chair. You speak of universal principles as protecting the vulnerable, but what happens when those same principles become weapons against the very people they're supposed to protect? Kant raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I follow. Take your famous example about lying to murderers. You argue that we must tell the truth even when asked by killers about their intended victims' whereabouts. The principle is beautifully consistent. Lying is always wrong, but the consequence is that innocent people die for the sake of your moral purity. The consequence is not my responsibility, Kant replied firmly. I am responsible only for the moral character of my own actions, not for the uses others make of the truth I tell. Arendt set down her cup with deliberate precision, and there it is, the fundamental flaw in your entire system. You've created a morality that allows people to wash their hands of the real-world consequences of their actions. You've made moral purity more important than human life. That's not, Kant began, but Arendt was on her feet again, pacing with renewed energy. It is exactly that. Your categorical imperative asks only one question. Can this action be universalized? It never asks, what happens to actual human beings if I act this way? It never demands that we take responsibility for the world our actions help create. She stopped in front of him, her eyes blazing with conviction. Do you know what I call this kind of thinking? The banality of evil. Not the evil of monsters, but the evil of people who follow rules without thinking about what those rules actually do to other people. The evil of bureaucrats who prioritize procedure over humanity. Kant's composure finally cracked. Hannah, that's unfair, and you know it. The categorical imperative specifically demands that we treat humanity, whether in our own person or that of another, always as an end, and never merely as a means. How is that ignoring human beings? Because it treats humanity as an abstract concept rather than recognizing the concrete particularity of actual human persons. Arendt shot back. Your humanity is a philosophical category. My concern is with Hans and Maria and Giuseppe, real people with names and faces and stories, people who suffer and hope and die, not as representatives of universal human nature, but as irreplaceable individuals. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in an amber twilight that seemed to soften the harsh edges of their disagreement without diminishing its intensity. Kant stood slowly, his age showing for the first time that evening. Hannah, I think you misunderstand what universality means in moral philosophy. It doesn't mean ignoring particularity. It means ensuring that our moral judgments aren't corrupted by favoritism, prejudice, or self-interest. When I apply the categorical imperative, I'm not ignoring the concrete features of situations. I'm ensuring that I would make the same judgment regardless of whether the person involved is my friend or my enemy, wealthy or poor, powerful or vulnerable. But that's exactly the problem, Arendt replied, her voice softer now but no less urgent. Moral situations aren't standardized test questions where we can simply apply the same formula and get the right answer. They're unique configurations of relationships, histories, possibilities, and constraints that require careful attention to their specific features. She moved to the window again, watching the last drops of rain trace paths down the glass. When Rosa saved that Jewish child, she wasn't applying a universal principle about saving children. She was responding to this particular child in these particular circumstances with this particular history of persecution. The morality of her action couldn't be captured by any universal formula. And yet, Kant said quietly, wouldn't you want to say that anyone in Rosa's situation should act as she did? Isn't that a universal claim? Arendt turned, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Yes, I suppose I would want to say that. Then you're appealing to exactly the kind of universal principle I'm advocating. The difference is that you want to make universality implicit and contextual, while I want to make it explicit and rational. For a moment, Arendt seemed genuinely stumped. The two philosophers stood in silence, the dying fire casting long shadows that made them appear like figures in an old painting, frozen in eternal debate. Finally, Arendt spoke, her voice thoughtful. Perhaps the difference isn't whether we believe in universal principles, but how we think those principles should operate. You want them to function like natural laws, apply the same formula, get the same result every time. I want them to function more like principles in art or music. Guidelines that inform judgment but don't replace it. That's an interesting analogy, Kant admitted, but doesn't it prove my point? We don't want justice to be like art, subjective, interpretive, dependent on individual taste and cultural fashion. We want justice to be reliable, consistent, impartial. Do we? Arendt asked, moving back toward her chair. Or do we want justice to be human, responsive to the actual conditions in which people live, capable of surprise, of new beginnings, of hope? She sat down, her movement graceful, despite the obvious fatigue both philosophers were beginning to feel. Here's what troubles me most about your approach, Emmanuel. It assumes that the highest human capacity is reason, that our ability to abstract from particular circumstances and derive universal principles is what makes us most fully human. But I think our highest capacity might be something else entirely, which is the capacity to begin again, to act in ways that interrupt cycles of causality and create genuinely new possibilities in the world, to respond to unprecedented situations with unprecedented wisdom, to take responsibility not just for following rules, but for the kind of world our actions help bring into being. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a strange, crystalline quiet that seemed to amplify every word spoken in the room. Both philosophers could sense they were approaching the deepest level of their disagreement, a fundamental difference about what it means to be human and what morality demands of human beings. The quiet after the storm felt charged with possibility, as if the cleared air had created space for new thoughts to emerge. Kant moved to the window where Arendt had stood, looking out at the campus washed clean by rain, streetlights reflecting in puddles like scattered stars. "Hannah," he said without turning around, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the capacity to begin again. It's not that I disagree with the importance of that capacity, but I worry about what happens when we make it central to our understanding of justice." He turned to face her, his expression more open than it had been all evening. "If justice is always beginning again, always responding to unprecedented situations with unprecedented wisdom, then what prevents it from simply being chaos? What ensures continuity, reliability, the kinds of protections that vulnerable people desperately need?" Arendt had been watching him carefully, noting the subtle shift in his tone. "You're asking about stability, about how society can function if we don't have predictable rules and procedures." "Exactly, and not just for abstract philosophical reasons. Real people need to know what to expect from their legal systems, their governments, their institutions. They need to be able to plan their lives around some basic assurances about how they'll be treated." "I hear you," Arendt said, leaning forward. "And I don't want to dismiss those concerns, but let me ask you this. What good are stable, predictable rules if they systematically exclude entire groups of people from their protection? What good is legal continuity if it continuously perpetuates injustice?" She stood and moved to the bookshelves lining one wall, running her fingers along the spines as if drawing wisdom from their collective weight. "The American Constitution is a perfect example. Beautiful principles. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, equal protection under law. But for most of the country's history, those principles didn't apply to women, to enslaved people, to indigenous populations, to countless others deemed somehow less than fully human. But that's exactly why we need universal principles," Kant interjected. "Those exclusions were inconsistencies, failures to apply the principles universally. The solution isn't to abandon the principles, but to extend them properly. Is it?" Arendt turned from the books to face him directly. "Or were those exclusions built into the very logic of universal principles? When you abstract from particular circumstances to derive universal laws, you necessarily ignore the concrete differences that make some people more vulnerable than others. You create principles that seem neutral, but actually reflect the perspectives and interests of whoever is doing the abstracting." She began to pace again, her movement sharp with intellectual energy. "Here's what I've learned from studying totalitarian movements, Emmanuel. They don't usually attack universal principles directly. They co-opt them. They claim to represent universal values: order, efficiency, national greatness, racial purity, ideological correctness. They appeal to people's desire for clarity, certainty, principles that rise above messy political compromise." Kant's face had grown pale. "You're comparing my moral philosophy to totalitarian ideology. I'm pointing out that the appeal to universal principles can be used to shut down the very kind of political thinking and judgment that democracy requires. When we claim to have figured out the universal laws of justice, we stop listening to the people who might challenge our conclusions. We stop paying attention to the ways our supposedly neutral principles actually serve some interests better than others." The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the weight of history was pressing down on both philosophers. Kant moved to his chair and sat heavily, looking older than he had at the beginning of their conversation. "Hannah, I understand your concerns about how universal principles can be misused, but consider the alternative you're proposing. If every moral and political decision requires fresh judgment in unprecedented situations, if we can't rely on established principles and procedures, then don't we end up with rule by whoever happens to be the most persuasive, the most charismatic, the most skilled at manipulation? Not if judgment is genuinely public, Arendt replied, settling back into her own chair. Not if it happens in spaces where multiple perspectives can be heard, where people can challenge each other's assumptions, where power is shared rather than concentrated. The problem isn't judgment itself. It's judgment made in isolation or by small groups of elites who don't have to face the consequences of their decisions. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts for what felt like a crucial point. You know what I think is the deepest difference between us? You believe that moral truth exists independently of human action and can be discovered through reason. I believe that moral meaning emerges from human action and can only be sustained through ongoing human commitment. Meaning the difference between discovering justice and creating justice, Kant said slowly. Exactly. For you, justice is like a mathematical theorem. It's true whether anyone recognizes it or not. For me, justice is like a promise. It only exists as long as people are willing to act on it, to make it real in the world through their choices and commitments. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, leaving the room lit primarily by the soft glow of table lamps. Both philosophers sat in contemplative silence, each recognizing that they had reached the heart of their disagreement. Finally, Kant spoke, his voice heavy with weariness. If you're right, Hannah, if justice is something we create rather than discover, then what hope do we have for genuine moral progress? What prevents justice from meaning whatever the most powerful groups want it to mean? The same thing that has always prevented it, Arendt replied quietly. People willing to think, to judge, to take responsibility for the world they share with others. People willing to act in ways that preserve space for human freedom and plurality. People willing to begin again when old forms of justice prove inadequate to new challenges. She looked directly at him, her expression serious, but not without warmth. The hope isn't in getting the principles right once and for all, Emmanuel. The hope is in our ongoing capacity to keep thinking, keep judging, keep taking responsibility for each other. That's what I call the human condition. Not the application of universal laws, but the endless work of creating and sustaining a world fit for human habitation. The conversation had reached a crescendo of disagreement, yet both philosophers could sense something else emerging, not resolution exactly, but a deeper appreciation for what each was trying to protect. The campus lay still under a blanket of stars that had emerged as the storm clouds dispersed. Through the windows, Kant and Arendt could see students crossing the quad, their voices carrying softly in the clear night air. Young people engaged in their own debates about justice, meaning, and how to live well in an uncertain world. Both philosophers had fallen into contemplative silence, the intellectual fire of their debate giving way to something quieter but no less profound. Kant was the first to break the stillness. Hannah, I've been thinking about your Rosa, the woman who saved the Jewish child, and I realized something that might surprise you. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Her action, as you describe it, might actually exemplify what I mean by moral autonomy. She didn't save the child because authorities told her to, or because it served her self-interest, or even because it felt good. She recognized another human being's dignity and acted on that recognition, regardless of personal cost. Arendt raised an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously like you're agreeing with me. Partially, Kant admitted with a slight smile. But here's where I think you might be agreeing with me, even if you don't realize it. When you talk about the capacity for judgment, for taking responsibility, for beginning again, aren't those themselves universal features of human beings? Aren't you arguing that all people, regardless of education or cultural background, possess these capacities and deserve to have them respected? Arendt was quiet for a moment, turning the observation over in her mind. You're suggesting that my critique of universality is itself based on universal claims about human nature. I'm suggesting that perhaps our disagreement isn't as fundamental as we thought. We both believe in human dignity. We both want justice that protects the vulnerable. We both recognize that moral thinking requires more than just following cultural conventions or immediate impulses. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. The difference might be more about method than ultimate goals. You emphasize the ongoing process of judgment and responsibility. I emphasize the rational principles that can guide that process, but maybe both are necessary. Arendt walked to the window, looking out at the students below. It's an interesting thought, and I'll admit there are aspects of your approach that I find valuable, even necessary. The insistence on consistency, on treating similar cases similarly, on not allowing personal favoritism to corrupt moral judgment. These aren't trivial concerns. She turned back toward him. But I still worry about what happens when we privilege abstract reasoning over concrete attention to particular situations and relationships. I still think there's something dangerous about moral systems that allow people to feel certain about their righteousness. And I still worry about moral approaches that can't provide clear guidance when people need it most, Kant replied. But perhaps the solution isn't choosing between reason and judgment, but finding ways to hold them in productive tension. The conversation had shifted, the adversarial edge softening into something more collaborative. Both philosophers seemed to recognize that their debate had illuminated important truths about the complexity of moral life, even if it hadn't resolved their fundamental differences. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Arendt said, settling back into her chair. "The students we've both taught over the years, the young people who come to us with genuine questions about how to live well, how to act justly in difficult circumstances. What would we tell them?" Kant considered the question seriously. "I would tell them that moral thinking requires both principles and judgment, that they need frameworks for thinking about right and wrong, but also the wisdom to apply those frameworks thoughtfully to particular situations, that the goal isn't moral perfection, but moral integrity, the alignment of action with our deepest convictions about human dignity." "I would tell them something similar," Arendt said with some surprise. "I would say that moral life requires both responsibility for the world as it is and commitment to the world as it could be, that they need to think carefully about their actions, but also be prepared to act even when they can't be certain about outcomes, that the goal isn't getting the right answer, but taking responsibility for their choices and their consequences." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both recognizing that they had traveled a considerable distance from their initial positions without completely abandoning them. "Perhaps," Kant said slowly, "the question isn't whether justice should be based on reason or compassion. Perhaps the question is how to cultivate both the intellectual rigor to think clearly about moral problems and the emotional wisdom to respond appropriately to human suffering, or how to create institutions and practices that support both principled consistency and responsive judgment," Arendt added. "Ways of organizing human affairs that provide stability and protection while remaining open to criticism and change." The night deepened around them, but neither philosopher seemed eager to end their conversation. They had discovered something unexpected. Not agreement exactly, but a recognition that their different approaches might be complementary rather than contradictory. "One more question," Arendt said. "If you had to choose, if you were forced to choose between a justice system that was perfectly rational but unresponsive to human particularity, and one that was perfectly responsive but provided no consistent principles, which would you choose?" Kant was quiet for a long time. "I suppose," he finally said, "I would refuse to choose. I would insist that real justice requires both, and I would commit myself to the ongoing work of figuring out how to achieve both." "Then perhaps," Arendt said with a smile, "we're not such different kinds of philosophers after all." As the evening wound toward its close, both thinkers recognized that their debate had accomplished something more important than winning or losing an argument. It had illuminated the irreducible complexity of moral life and the ongoing human responsibility to keep thinking, keep judging, and keep striving for justice in an imperfect world. The question of whether justice should be based on reason or compassion remained unanswered, not because it was unanswerable, but because the answer required the kind of wisdom that emerges only from the ongoing practice of thinking and acting together in the spaces between certainty and chaos, between universal principles and particular responsibilities, between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. Outside, the students had disappeared into dormitories and libraries, but their conversations would continue, as would the eternal human struggle to live together justly in a world that offers no easy answers, but demands our best efforts nonetheless.